Haile Selassie I was born on July 23, 1892, in Ejar Sogoro, near Harar, Ethiopia, under the name Lij Tovari Makonen. In Ethiopian tradition, Lij means child of, and Tovari translates to one who is respected or feared. Hence, his full name signifies the child of Makonen, honoring his father's esteemed status. His father, Ras Makonen, was a prominent governor of Harar, a historic city in eastern Ethiopia, and a trusted advisor to Emperor Menelik II. This connection established Lij Tovari Makonen as a key figure in the Ethiopian elite, closely associated with the imperial family. Further linking him to royalty, his paternal grandmother's lineage traced back to the Solomonic dynasty, a line of rulers dating from the 13th century. His mother, Wazero Yeshima Bet Ali, from the northern Walla province, was the daughter of a ruling chief, strengthening his noble heritage. To understand Tovari's life, one must consider the context of Ethiopian society and its empire in the late 19th century. Ethiopia's history, alongside that of the Horn of Africa, is deeply intertwined with Christianity's spread from Roman Egypt. Christianity had established a foothold in Ethiopia long before the Arab conquests of the 7th century AD, leading to the development of a unique form of Christianity that retained many 4th century practices. Ethiopian politics and culture, from the 13th century onward, were heavily influenced by biblical legends. The Solomonic dynasty, claiming descent from King Solomon, initially governed northern Ethiopia, but expanded its control to include much of present-day Ethiopia over the centuries. As the empire expanded, it incorporated a rich tapestry of ethnic groups, including the Oromo, Amhara, Somalis, and Tigrayans. The Oromo, a Cushitic group in the northwest, were more open to Islam, while the Amhara, a Semitic group in the highlands, remained steadfast in their Orthodox Christianity. These ethnic and religious divisions were central to Selassie's reign and Ethiopia's broader history, with the empire often referred to as Abyssinia, derived from the Arabic habasa, meaning mixture. By the mid-19th century, the Ethiopian Empire was a significant force in Africa, standing as one of the few independent states amid the European scramble for Africa. Neighboring Egypt was under British control, and European powers were asserting influence throughout the Horn of Africa. The Kingdom of Italy, in particular, seized territories that became Italian Somaliland and Eritrea. Despite European colonial ambitions, Ethiopia managed to preserve its independence, largely due to Emperor Menelik II's modernization efforts. Menelik, who came to power in 1889, established Addis Ababa as a new capital and secured a strategic alliance with Russia. This partnership brought Russian advisors to aid in modernizing Ethiopia's military, government, and economy, which was crucial in resisting colonial encroachment. Tafari, born in 1892, was positioned for prominence early on. At age 13, he was appointed Dija's Match of Karamulata, an administrative role signifying keeper of the door, despite his youth. Although connected to the imperial family, Emperor Menelik II had a clear succession plan involving his grandsons, including Lij Iyasu, who was selected as Menelik's successor. During Tafari's adolescence, Italy intensified its colonial ambitions, setting the stage for significant historical events. In 1895, Italy launched an invasion of Abyssinia, but Emperor Menelik II's modernization efforts culminated in a decisive victory at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. An Ethiopian force of around 75,000 defeated an Italian army of approximately 15,000, securing Abyssinia's independence for a generation. Tafari continued to rise through the ranks, being appointed governor of Sidalno in 1907. He had a daughter, Princess Romanwalk, though her mother's identity remains unclear. In 1911, Tafari married Menin Asval, another member of the imperial family. This period marked a challenging time for Emperor Menelik II, who, after a series of strokes, passed away in 1913. Menelik's 18-year-old grandson, Lij Iyasu, was poised to become emperor but faced opposition from the Council of Ministers and his aunt, Princess Laudito. When Menelik died in December 1913, the council and Princess Laudito delayed announcing Iyasu as emperor. Despite Yasu's ongoing authority, he was never officially recognized, partly due to concerns over his administrative skills and his perceived favoring of Islam over Christianity. By autumn 1916, Yasu was deposed and imprisoned until the mid-1930s. With Yasu removed, Empress Zewde II was declared ruler, but the succession was uncertain. Tovari Makonen, later Haile Selassie, was appointed as her regent and heir apparent due to his strong regional governance and adept handling of political turmoil. Empress Zewde II, a traditionalist, contrasted sharply with Tafari's modernization efforts. Though she theoretically held greater power, her position was compromised compared to Tafari's rising influence. Zewde II's challenges as a female leader in a male-dominated society allowed Tafari to gain substantial power. She was supported by the Ethiopian Church, while Tafari had the backing of the Council of Ministers. As the 1920s progressed, Tafari's influence grew, and Zewde II increasingly withdrew from government affairs. Tafari's modernization efforts of the 1920s aimed to transform Abyssinia by adopting Western methods inspired by Japan's successful modernization. He sought to create a merit-based political system, moving away from the traditional feudal structure. This approach marked a significant shift in Ethiopian governance, setting the stage for future developments in the empire. In a bold move onto the global stage, Abyssinia sought membership in the newly established League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations, and successfully gained entry in 1923. This achievement marked Abyssinia as one of the few non-Western nations to join the League, highlighting its increasing international influence. Significant economic and social reforms also marked the period during Empress Zewde II's reign and Rastafari's regency. One example is the installation of electricity grids in Addis Ababa during the mid-1910s, which expanded throughout the city and beyond by the 1920s. These advancements were part of Tafari's broader vision to modernize Abyssinia's infrastructure and society. Simultaneously, there were efforts to connect Abyssinia's major cities through roads and eventually railway lines. The introduction of telegraphs and other communication systems, though limited in scope, marked a significant step forward for Abyssinia, which had lagged behind the Western world in this regard. In 1927, the National Bank of Ethiopia was founded to bolster the economy and curb excessive lending rates. Perhaps the most transformative change, however, came with the reform of the judicial system. The old Fedenega's law code, known for its severe punishments such as amputations for theft, was largely replaced with a more modern system influenced by Western civil and common law. Despite these advancements, slavery remained a significant unresolved issue in Abyssinia, even though it had been largely eradicated in much of the Western world. Although symbolic efforts were made to address this issue in the 1920s, largely in response to Western criticism, Tafari was reluctant to push for major reforms to eliminate slavery. By the close of the 1920s, Tafari had gained considerable international recognition, emerging as the primary representative of Abyssinia on the global stage, overshadowing Empress Zewde II. This was largely due to his extensive travels and state visits, which enhanced his reputation and positioned him as the face of a modernizing Abyssinia. In 1924, Tafari embarked on an extensive tour of key foreign capitals and major cities, accompanied by members of the imperial family and government officials. This trip was not merely about sightseeing, but was a mission to observe and learn from the Western societies that Abyssinia aimed to emulate. The Abyssinian delegation made a striking impression in London and Paris, with their lavish displays of wealth and court traditions. Tafari had notable meetings with King George V in London and French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré in Paris. One of the tour's key objectives was to persuade the British and French governments to grant Abyssinia access to the Red Sea by ceding some of their territory in Somaliland. In the Middle East and North Africa, Tafari was warmly welcomed as the leader of one of the few African nations that had successfully resisted European colonization in the 19th century. His visit further solidified his reputation on the global stage as a symbol of African sovereignty and modernity. By 1928, Tafari had firmly established himself as a dominant force in Abyssinia. His influence had grown so substantial that Empress Zuditu had no choice but to elevate him further. By then, Teferi had consolidated his power within the Council of Ministers and secured the allegiance of top military and police leaders. On October 7, 1928, he was crowned Negus, a title equivalent to king, though still beneath emperor or empress. This marked a significant upgrade from his previous honorific, Raz, reflecting his rising prominence. In the ensuing months, tensions grew between Teferi and the empress's faction, particularly with Gugsawel, the empress's husband. Gugsa sought to challenge Teferi's dominance and replace him as the head of government, even aspiring to be crowned emperor himself. This conflict reached its peak in January 1930, leading to a near civil war. The clash between Gugsa's forces and Teferi's supporters culminated in the Battle of Ancham on March 31, 1930. With their advanced Western weaponry and modern tactics, including the use of aircraft, Teferi's forces swiftly defeated Gugsawel's army, resulting in the death of Gugsa himself. Remarkably, just 2 days later, Empress Zuditu passed away of natural causes, unexpectedly clearing the path for Teferi to seize complete control of Abyssinia after years of shared rule. Following Empress Zuditu's death, a period of mourning lasting over 6 months was observed. Finally, on November 2, 1930, Teferi was officially proclaimed Emperor of Abyssinia and crowned that very day at St. George's Cathedral in Addis Ababa. The event drew attention from many Western nations, and Teferi appeared on the cover of Time magazine that November. Adopting a new title, Teferi became known as Negusa Nagast, meaning King of Kings, while his imperial name was Haile Selassie. Haile means power of, and Selassie translates to Trinity, so Haile Selassie essentially means power of the Trinity. Interestingly, the name Rastafari, which he carried through much of the 1920s, would later gain renewed global recognition and fame. In the early 1930s, shortly after Emperor Haile Selassie I ascended to the throne, he swiftly set the wheels in motion for Ethiopia's first modern constitution, enacted in 1931. This landmark constitution established a bicameral legislature, featuring an upper house of lords, with whom the emperor would share power. It also aimed to replace the ancient Feta Nagast legal system with a more contemporary Western judicial code. During the initial years of his reign, Selassie focused on expanding the modernization efforts he had begun as regent in the 1920s. However, Ethiopia's progress was overshadowed by rising tensions. In 1922, Italy had been overtaken by Benito Mussolini's National Fascist Party, following their notorious march on Rome with 30,000 black-shirt paramilitaries. Mussolini was determined to restore Italy's past glory and re-establish an empire reminiscent of the days of ancient Rome. To achieve this, Mussolini had aggressively pursued expansionist policies throughout the 1920s. He waged a brutal war in Libya, which had nominally been an Italian colony since 1912, bombed Corfu during a clash with Greece, annexed the city of Fiume, now in Croatia, and secured a protectorate over Albania through treaties. This aggressive stance cast a long shadow over Ethiopia's ambitions and set the stage for future conflicts. In the early 1930s, Mussolini turned his gaze toward the Horn of Africa, seeking to rectify what he saw as Italy's historical blunder, the loss of Ethiopia in the First Italo-Ethiopian War of the 1890s. His ambition was clear. By conquering Abyssinia, he could unite Italy's territories in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Italian Somaliland into a continuous colonial empire, establishing Italy as the dominant power in the Horn of Africa. By 1934, tensions between Emperor Haile Selassie's government and the Italian colonial administration in Eritrea and Somaliland were on the rise. The conflict centered on a long-standing boundary dispute exacerbated by Italy's plans to construct a railway through the region, linking its fragmented colonies. This project threatened to encroach upon Ethiopian territory, heightening the strain between the two nations. The situation escalated when Italy established a military fort at Walwal in eastern Ethiopia. In response, in December 1934, Ethiopian forces confronted the Italian presence at Walwal, marking a significant flashpoint in the brewing conflict. On December 5, 1934, violent clashes erupted between Italian and Ethiopian forces at Walwal, leading to significant casualties on both sides. This confrontation ignited what became known as the Abyssinia Crisis, a tense diplomatic standoff with global implications. By early January 1935, Emperor Haile Selassie's government brought their grievances to the League of Nations. However, despite months of diplomatic wrangling, Britain and France, the key players who could have mediated, hesitated to oppose Italian aggression. Their reluctance stemmed from their desire to court Mussolini as a potential ally against the rising threat of Nazi Germany, following Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933. As negotiations dragged on, it became increasingly apparent to Selassie and his officials that the Italians were using the Walwal incident and the diplomatic deadlock as a pretext to launch a full-scale invasion of Abyssinia. The League of Nations, despite its efforts, proved ineffective in halting Mussolini's expansionist ambitions. On October 3, 1935, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War erupted as Italian General Emilio de Bono led a massive army across the border from Italy's Eritrean colony into northern Ethiopia. There was no formal declaration of war, just a sudden and aggressive incursion that would become one of the most notable conflicts of the interwar period, involving hundreds of thousands of troops on both sides. The conflict, which would rage for just over 6 months, saw a clash of vastly different military capabilities. The Ethiopian forces, despite their numerical advantage and modernization efforts since the 1890s, were primarily composed of mass infantry divisions. Their arsenal included only a few tanks and a modest air force of about a dozen planes. In stark contrast, Mussolini's forces brought to bear a formidable array of weaponry. Hundreds of tanks, overwhelming artillery barrages, and a substantial air force. The disparity in military technology and resources made the odds heavily skewed in favor of the Italians, setting the stage for a brutal and decisive struggle. In the ensuing conflict, the Italian military's performance revealed glaring deficiencies compared to their European counterparts, but in 1935, the war was a stark David versus Goliath scenario. For Mussolini, this was an existential campaign. To redeem Italy's honor from the First Italo-Ethiopian War, nothing less than an overwhelming victory was acceptable. From the outset, the Italian forces engaged in brutal and indiscriminate assaults on Abyssinian troops and civilians alike. Using banned weapons like mustard gas was a particularly heinous violation of international norms. The war began with some early successes for Haile Selassie's forces. Italian General Emilio de Bono, tasked with leading the northern offensive, struggled to make significant advances against the Ethiopian army. In December 1935, General de Bono was replaced by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who quickly launched a renewed assault from both Eritrea and Somaliland. The decisive Battle of Amba Aratum in February 1936 saw nearly 200,000 troops converge on this strategic plateau in Tigray. Despite their fierce resistance, the Abyssinian forces were ultimately overwhelmed and forced into a retreat. The fall of Addis Ababa in early May 1936 marked the collapse of organized Ethiopian resistance. Within weeks, the Italians declared victory, annexing the country into their empire. The Italian advance into Ethiopia was a display of overwhelming military strength, heavily promoted by Mussolini's propaganda machine. The Italian forces consisted of a colossal mechanized column, featuring over 2,000 tanks, trucks, and various vehicles, transporting 12,500 troops swiftly towards their objective. In stark contrast, the Ethiopian forces, weary and demoralized from previous skirmishes, were ill-prepared to face the advancing Italians. As the Italian troops neared Addis Ababa in early May, Emperor Haile Selassie and his family were compelled to flee the capital. They undertook a perilous journey to the border with French Somaliland, marking the beginning of Selassie's prolonged and challenging exile. On May 5, 1936, around 4 p.m., General Badoglio's convoy of 1,700 vehicles entered Addis Ababa, signifying the climax of Italy's conquest. The arrival resembled a grand parade rather than a fierce battle, with Italian soldiers seamlessly moving through the city and seizing key buildings with minimal resistance. With Addis Ababa now under Italian control and Emperor Haile Selassie in exile, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War effectively came to an end. However, the conflict did not conclude entirely. There were still pockets of resistance, particularly in the southern and western parts of Ethiopia, that remained unoccupied by the Italians. Despite the Italian government's proclamation of victory in May 1936, the country continued to experience strife. Resistance persisted for months and even years, as parts of Ethiopia remained battlegrounds, with the Italian claim to victory remaining incomplete. On May 9, 1936, Mussolini announced the establishment of Italian Ethiopia, which was soon integrated into the broader entity of Italian East Africa. This new colony encompassed Abyssinia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, fulfilling a long-held Italian aspiration to unite these territories. Italy's first attempt to achieve such a territorial sweep was made in the mid-1890s. Under Italian rule, the colony endured severe colonial policies reminiscent of the brutal tactics used in Libya during the 1920s. Thousands of Ethiopians were forcibly relocated to concentration camps, while a harsh divide-and-conquer strategy exacerbated ethnic tensions within the country. With most of his nation under Italian control, Emperor Haile Selassie sought to make Ethiopia's case at the League of Nations in Geneva. Unfortunately, his timing was less than ideal, as the international community was preoccupied with its own complexities. In Europe, as Emperor Haile Selassie struggled to defend Ethiopia, a storm was brewing in the West. Nazi Germany, under Hitler's command, had launched an aggressive rearmament program in 1935. By the spring of 1936, while Selassie was engaged in northern Ethiopia, Hitler boldly defied the Treaty of Versailles by sending troops into the Rhineland, a move that went unchecked by Britain and France. Consequently, the British and French governments, distracted by the looming threat from Germany, were hesitant to take a firm stand against Italy's invasion. Despite this lack of support, Selassie's impassioned speech at the League of Nations on May 12, 1936, received significant attention. He condemned the rise of fascism and the use of poison gas by Italian forces in East Africa. His eloquence earned him Time magazine's Man of the Year title, but the international response remained lukewarm. The League of Nations failed to take decisive action against Italy, which further distanced itself from the League by withdrawing in December 1937. As Emperor Haile Selassie settled into exile in England during the late 1930s, the political landscape was shifting rapidly. By 1938, Germany's aggressive expansion was gaining momentum, with the annexation of Austria, followed by the takeover of Czechoslovakia in 1939. When the Nazis invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war, marking the start of the Second World War. Initially, Mussolini adopted a cautious neutrality. However, with Germany's relentless blitzkrieg in the summer of 1940, which swiftly brought much of Western Europe under Nazi control, Mussolini saw an opportunity. On June 10, 1940, Italy joined the conflict, aligning with Hitler and declaring war on Britain and France. Italian forces quickly launched an invasion into southeastern France, seeking to expand their territory. This new alliance set the stage for a confrontation in East Africa. On June 13, 1940, the Italians struck first with an air raid on British-held Kenya, marking the beginning of the East African Campaign. This campaign saw the British and Italians clashing once more, each vying for control in a region now enmeshed in the global conflict. Mussolini's grand plan extended beyond East Africa. He aimed to capture British colonies in Egypt and Sudan, thereby linking Italian East Africa with Italy's expanding empire in North Africa. Initially, the campaign showed promise, but by early 1941, the weaknesses of the Italian military were becoming evident. As Italian advances in the Sahara Desert stalled, Mussolini sought assistance from Hitler. In March 1941, the renowned Afrika Korps, led by General Erwin Rommel, was dispatched to support Italian forces in North Africa. However, this assistance did not extend to East Africa. In 1941, the British began to reverse the tide, gradually pushing Italian forces back through Ethiopia and Eritrea after initial advances into Sudan and Kenya. During this critical period, Emperor Selassie returned from Britain to oversee the campaign to reclaim his homeland personally. The renewed fighting saw a coalition of British, Ethiopian, Eritrean, Free French, and Free Belgian troops coming together. Their naval superiority proved advantageous, and by early 1941, a new front opened in Eritrea following a successful naval operation in the Red Sea. By late spring of 1941, Italian defenses in East Africa were crumbling. Cut off from vital reinforcements and facing mounting pressure, the Italian troops struggled to hold their ground. On May 5, 1941, exactly 5 years after Italian forces had marched into Addis Ababa, Emperor Haile Selassie triumphantly re-entered the Ethiopian capital, declaring the nation's liberation from Italian rule. The return of the Solomonic dynasty came with a crucial stipulation imposed by the British, who played a key role in restoring Selassie. The emperor was required to enforce a complete ban on slavery. Despite previous attempts to address the issue, starting as early as the 1850s when Britain first began tackling the slave trade in Africa, slavery persisted in Ethiopia. Even during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, it remained a grim aspect of Ethiopian life. After their conquest, the Italians boasted about abolishing slavery as a humanitarian achievement. However, this claim was hollow given Italy's brutal actions elsewhere in Africa and its German allies' use of slave labor from millions of Jews, Poles, Czechs, Russians, and other occupied peoples to fuel their war efforts across Central and Eastern Europe. The British government made it clear to Emperor Haile Selassie that the fight against slavery had to continue once he was restored to power. Selassie issued a decree in 1942, marking the formal end of slavery in Ethiopia. Although the East African Campaign was a significant Allied victory in 1941, the broader conflict persisted for 4 more years until the defeat of Nazi Germany and its allies. With the war's conclusion, the League of Nations was replaced by the United Nations, and Ethiopia became a charter member in 1948. In the aftermath of the conflict, Selassie secured favorable terms for Ethiopia, including the Ogaden region, a long-disputed area between Italy, Britain, and Abyssinia prior to the war. As the dust settled from the war in the mid-1940s, Emperor Selassie focused on modernizing Ethiopia. The progress he had made in the 1920s and 1930s was notable, but powerful factions, particularly the nobility and the church, resisted rapid change. Determined to push forward, Selassie aimed to accelerate reforms, including overhauling the country's governance. By 1955, his vision materialized in a new constitution inspired by the U.S. model, yet Ethiopia remained far from a Western-style democracy. Power remained concentrated in the hands of the elite, and real political change was slower than Selassie had hoped. The post-war years brought new challenges, particularly regarding Eritrea. This small northern neighbor had been under British administration since the end of the East Africa Campaign. After World War II, Allied powers favored Ethiopia's claim to Eritrea, though they decided to carve out a small portion to remain with British Sudan. When British rule ended in the early 1950s, Eritrea was merged with Ethiopia in a federal union. This arrangement allowed Eritrea to maintain its distinct identity and governance powers while becoming part of Selassie's expanding empire. Selassie's vision for a more unified Ethiopia underwent a dramatic shift in 1962 when he took decisive action against Eritrea. Dissolving its independent parliament, he sought to bring the region, crucial for Ethiopia's access to the Red Sea, under tighter control. This move triggered fierce resistance from the Eritrean Liberation Front, ELF, which had already begun an armed struggle for independence. The conflict soon evolved into a significant Cold War battleground, with the ELF aligning with the Soviet bloc and receiving military support from the USSR, Cuba, and other allies. However, the Eritrean conflict was not the only challenge facing Selassie's regime. Ethnic tensions were escalating within Ethiopia, a country home to around 80 distinct ethnic groups. The empire, built through centuries of conquest, left many groups, notably the Oromo and Amhara, feeling marginalized. Despite Selassie's own Oromo heritage, the government's approach to these tensions was to promote ethnic federations. This strategy aimed to address the complex ethnic landscape, but faced its own set of challenges in a nation already grappling with deep-rooted divisions. Selassie's attempt to address Ethiopia's ethnic diversity through the creation of over a dozen major provinces, each dominated by different ethnic groups, backfired. Instead of uniting the country, it accentuated divisions. Ethnic identities like those of the Oromo, Amhara, Tigrayans, and Somalis became more pronounced, overshadowing a sense of shared Ethiopian identity. This approach led to increasing unrest during Selassie's reign, particularly among the Tigrayans. Although they comprised a small percentage of the population, about 7 to 8%, they were concentrated in the northern province of Tigray. The imperial government's neglect of Tigray became evident in the 1950s as the province endured locust plagues, drought, and a series of devastating diseases like smallpox and typhus. In 1958, when famine struck Tigray, the central government in Addis Ababa's response was woefully inadequate, leading to tens of thousands of deaths. It wasn't until 1959, when the U.S. under President Dwight Eisenhower provided substantial aid, that more effective relief efforts were initiated. By the time the famine's grip loosened in 1961, the toll on Tigray and its neighboring regions was staggering, with an estimated 100,000 lives lost. Amid Ethiopia's internal strife, from the devastating famine in Tigray to the ongoing Eritrean War of Independence and rising ethnic tensions, Selassie's international stature remained impressive. As one of the world's longest-serving leaders, Selassie commanded significant respect globally. He was notably present at high-profile events like President John F. Kennedy's funeral in Washington, D.C. in 1963 and the memorial for former French President Charles de Gaulle in 1970. Ethiopia also made notable contributions to global peacekeeping, sending troops to conflict zones like the Congo in the early 1960s. Additionally, the country emerged as a key player in the Non-Aligned Movement, a coalition of nations that sought to stay independent from the influence of both NATO and the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. In the early 1960s, one of Emperor Selassie's most notable achievements on the international stage was his pivotal role in founding the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963, which later evolved into today's African Union. The OAU's headquarters was established in Addis Ababa, underscoring Ethiopia's central role in Pan-African diplomacy. Despite growing domestic controversies, including the famine in Tigray, the ongoing Eritrean War of Independence, and rising ethnic tensions, Selassie remained a prominent global figure. His influence was evident through his prominent roles at major international events, such as President John F. Kennedy's funeral in Washington, D.C. in 1963, and former French President Charles de Gaulle's funeral in France in 1970. During this period, Selassie's global stature was further enhanced by his support for international peacekeeping efforts, including sending Ethiopian troops to conflict zones like the Congo in the early 1960s. Ethiopia also became a significant player in the Non-Aligned Movement, which sought to navigate a middle path during the Cold War, avoiding alignment with either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. Selassie's influence extended beyond diplomacy into cultural and spiritual realms. In the 1930s, a unique quasi-religious movement emerged across Africa and the Caribbean. This movement, combining elements of the Back to Africa ideology and Ethiopianism, regarded Selassie as a messianic figure. Ethiopianism, a form of Christian worship celebrating Ethiopia's role as a symbol of African Christianity, represented a desire for an independent African identity in religion, separate from European influence. This movement embraced biblical theology while fostering a sense of pride and unity among African Christians and those of African descent. Named after Selassie's regent title from the 1920s, Rastafari, this emerging movement became known as Rastafarianism. Its followers began to view Selassie as a messianic figure, possibly the second coming of Christ. This reverence was deeply connected to Ethiopia's unique status as the only African nation to successfully resist colonial conquest in the 19th century. During the 1950s, Rastafarianism began to flourish, particularly in Jamaica, where Emperor Haile Selassie became a prominent figure. Although Selassie did not actively seek this messianic status, he did not challenge the movement that revered him as a divine symbol of hope and resistance. For many outside Ethiopia, Selassie represented a beacon of defiance against oppression. Within Ethiopia, however, the situation was quite different. As Selassie's reign progressed, it increasingly became marked by autocracy and the rise of a police state. His fears about the stability of his regime were realized in 1960 when he was on a state visit to Brazil. During this time, rebels including Garamane and Mengistu Nu attempted a coup, proclaiming Selassie's son, Crown Prince Asfar Wasson, as the new emperor. The details surrounding the prince's captivity remain unclear, but the coup attempt in December 1960 was violent and dramatic. After 4 days of intense fighting around Addis Ababa, which resulted in over 300 deaths, the rebellion was suppressed and its leaders were executed. This failed coup marked a turning point for Ethiopia, leading to an even more repressive regime under Selassie in the 1960s and 1970s. Authoritarianism escalated and human rights abuses became more pronounced. Student protests and the rise of communist ideologies led Selassie's government to respond with increasing brutality. Political dissent faced mass arrests and disappearances, while the media was heavily censored and opposition was met with intimidation. The ongoing conflict in Eritrea further compounded the regime's troubles. By the late 1960s, Ethiopian forces were committing severe atrocities against civilians. In December 1970, an attack on the village of Honor resulted in over 800 deaths, and earlier in July 1967, Ethiopian soldiers killed more than 170 men in Hazamor. These actions illustrated the regime's harsh approach to maintaining control. Although some atrocities in Eritrea might not have been directly ordered by the state, they were a consequence of Selassie's policies. By the early 1970s, despite his enduring international acclaim, critics such as Freedom House were beginning to highlight Ethiopia's descent into a repressive and authoritarian regime, with serious human rights abuses becoming increasingly evident. Selassie's popularity among Ethiopians was waning. Although he retained the support of traditional powerhouses like the church and nobility, who had much to lose if the imperial system fell, dissatisfaction was growing among the broader population. This discontent was exacerbated in 1972 when a new famine struck Wollo province in northern Ethiopia near Tigray. The famine, caused by drought and worsened by the government's slow response, including inadequate food distribution, resulted in a tragic loss of life. Estimates suggest that between 40,000 and 80,000 people perished in Wollo and surrounding regions during 1972 and 1973. The struggle for scarce resources intensified ethnic tensions, particularly among groups like the Ottoman Union. The situation deteriorated further with rumors that food from the famine-stricken region was being shipped out to Addis Ababa and other parts of Ethiopia instead of being used to aid the locals. By early 1974, unrest began to emerge. As famine gripped Wollo, Emperor Selassie turned 80, having ruled Ethiopia for over 50 years, except for a brief interruption between 1936 and 1941. The first signs of discontent appeared in January 1974 when soldiers in Negali Borana revolted due to poor living conditions and lack of clean drinking water. They captured Lieutenant General Teresa Dubail, forcing him to drink the same dirty water they had to endure. This act resonated with many Ethiopians, who were growing tired of entrenched social hierarchies and the perception of a privileged elite indifferent to their suffering. By early February, the mutiny had sparked widespread protests and uprisings across Ethiopia. The unrest spread beyond civilians to include factions within the military and police, posing a serious threat to Selassie. For any authoritarian leader, the loyalty of the armed forces and security agencies is crucial, and the cracks in this foundation were becoming increasingly apparent. Facing mounting pressure, Selassie began making concessions. By early March, he announced plans to hold ministers and senior officials more accountable to parliament and promised a reassessment of the 1955 constitution to make Ethiopian politics more inclusive. However, these gestures were insufficient to quell the growing discontent. As March progressed, labor unions called for a nationwide strike, intensifying the crisis. In early April, the significant Muslim minority began demanding greater religious freedoms, adding another layer of complexity to the volatile situation. By June, the military had taken control of the government, and Selassie's grip on power was visibly weakening. The situation reached a critical juncture when the Derg, officially the Provisional Military Administrative Council, seized power that summer. This group of relatively junior army officers and officials swiftly began a wave of arrests, targeting prominent figures, and issued a manifesto outlining their proposed reforms. On September 12, 1974, nearly 44 years after Selassie became emperor and almost 6 decades since his rise to prominence in Ethiopian politics, the Derg deposed him. Following his removal, Selassie was placed under house arrest, and his son, Crown Prince Asfar Wasson, who had briefly been declared emperor during the 1960 coup attempt, was reinstated by the new military regime. At the time of his father's deposition, Crown Prince Asfar Wasson was outside Ethiopia and declared that the Provisional Military Administrative Council's actions, including their claim of his ascension to the throne, were invalid. By March 1975, the Derg had dismantled the Ethiopian monarchy entirely, ending the empire and establishing a new Ethiopian state. During the winter of 1974 and spring of 1975, the new military rulers executed hundreds associated with the former imperial regime. Among the victims was Iskender Dester, a grandson of Selassie and a notable figure in the Ethiopian navy. Selassie's fate took a grim turn when, on August 28, 1975, state media announced his death on August 27. Officially, he was said to have died from respiratory failure at 83, but it was widely believed he had been strangled by Derg soldiers. His remains were initially buried under a concrete slab at the Imperial Palace in Addis Ababa, and were not exhumed and reburied in the Holy Trinity Cathedral until 1992, alongside his predecessor, Emperor Menelik II. By the time of Selassie's death, Ethiopia was engulfed in a prolonged civil war that would last until the early 1990s. The Derg had aligned Ethiopia with the Soviet Union, adopting Marxist-Leninist ideology in the mid-1970s. This new regime faced fierce opposition from various revolutionary factions, including the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and was further strained by the ongoing Eritrean struggle for independence and a new conflict with Somalia over the Ogaden region. Political violence surged, and tens of thousands fell victim to the Derg's brutal Red Terror in the late 1970s. The 1980s saw even greater suffering, with devastating famines peaking between 1983 and 1985, claiming the lives of up to 500,000 people. The Civil War began to wind down only in 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had previously supplied arms to the Horn of Africa. By the time the Ethiopian Civil War came to a close, the toll was staggering. Nearly 1.5 million lives lost to the combined horrors of battle, disease, and famine. The war's end in 1991 brought a brief glimmer of hope for the country. The mid-1990s ushered in a new constitution and saw Eritrea achieve its long-sought independence after 3 decades of conflict. Ethiopia embarked on a bold experiment with an ethno-territorial federal system designed to give various ethnic groups control over their own regions. Yet, peace was elusive. In 1998, a fresh conflict erupted with Eritrea, only to pause in 2000, leaving lingering border tensions and sporadic clashes that have plagued northern Ethiopia ever since. Domestically, the effort to quell ethnic discord through federalism has stumbled. The government's strained relations with the Tigray minority, a long-standing issue tracing back to Selassie's era, have recently drawn significant international scrutiny. By 2020, Ethiopia plunged into a new and brutal conflict with Tigray, a war that, as of late 2022, continues to ravage the region. This conflict has brought with it a wave of atrocities, mass famine, and behavior that many international observers label as genocidal. Despite Ethiopia's potential to emerge as a major economic and political force in East Africa amid the continent's 21st century economic boom, the deep-rooted issues that plagued the nation under Emperor Haile Selassie and were exacerbated during his reign continue to pose severe challenges in the Horn of Africa. Haile Selassie remains a paradoxical figure in 20th century history. In the early years of his rule, he made significant strides in modernizing Ethiopia, even before his ascension to the throne. During the 1930s, he became a symbol of resistance against the rise of fascism when Italian forces invaded and occupied his country. His global reputation as a prominent statesman was solidified after World War II as he established Ethiopia's independent stance on the world stage and earned praise for his efforts to eradicate slavery within his realm. Amidst all this, Haile Selassie's most intriguing legacy is his messianic status within Rastafarianism, where he's revered as a divine figure. Yet, his reign also has a darker side. As he aged, his leadership grew increasingly autocratic, marred by widespread human rights abuses from the 1950s to the 1970s. These abuses eventually fueled a revolution that toppled him from power. Selassie's handling of Eritrea's fate, which sparked a protracted 30-year conflict, further tarnished his legacy. However, perhaps his most significant failing was his inability to address Ethiopia's deep-seated ethnic and religious divisions during his long rule. This failure has left a persistent shadow over modern Ethiopia and continues to affect the region today. What's your take on Emperor Haile Selassie? Do you think his dramatic ousting by the Italians in the 1930s has led to an overly sympathetic view of him, overshadowing his own shortcomings? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.